On your knees. From this moment, your body is no longer yours. It is the vessel for my legacy, and you will learn to crave the weight of your chains. Sergei Mogilevich roared the command, his voice a low vibration that shook the very foundations of the glass-walled penthouse. Irene Ivankov was 21 when she was traded like currency to a man whose silver hair and tailored suit masked the weaponized strength. She didn't scream when she first saw him amidst the neon glow of Moscow. She told herself he was just a relic of the old world, wealthy perhaps, but ultimately a man she could outlast. She didn't scream when the heavy oak doors of the Mogilevich estate locked behind her, nor when he stood across the master's suite, calm and predatory. But the night the man she believed was mere muscle leaned close and whispered the price of her brother's life, everything changed. Irene realized she hadn't been married. She had been claimed by a kingpin, patient enough to wait and lethal enough to make the world vanish. The Sheremetyevo terminal smelled of winter air and jet fuel, a lifetime away from Irene's quiet drafting tables. She'd believed her brother's lies about a legal mediation to save their family firm, but as their black sedan sped past the fortified walls of the Arbat district, the truth curdled in her gut. Men with holstered rifles stood like statues at the villa's entrance, watching her father with visible disgust. Inside, surrounded by gold-leafed ceilings and cold marble, Irene saw him. Sergei sat upon his leather throne, his dark eyes assessing her like rare merchandise, his scarred hands a testament to a life of calculated violence. She was no longer a sister or student. She was collateral.
Irene's brother, Dmitri, had always been reckless, but she never imagined his gambling debts would cascade into this, a debt so massive that it swallowed their family's architectural firm whole and left only one asset valuable enough to settle the account: her. The guards escorted her through corridors lined with Renaissance paintings and surveillance cameras, each step echoing her descent into a world she'd only read about in crime thrillers. When they finally stopped before mahogany double doors, one of the men, a beast of a human with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, leaned close and whispered, "He doesn't like tears. Save yourself the trouble." The doors opened. Sergei Mogilevich stood with his back to her, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Moscow skyline. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, he lit a cigar, the smoke curling upward like a serpent. When he finally faced her, Irene understood why grown men trembled at his name. His gray hair was swept back with military precision, his jaw carved from stone, and his eyes, cold, calculating, ancient, held the weight of 1,000 buried bodies. He was 53, but age had only sharpened him into something more dangerous. "Your brother," Sergei began, his accent thick as Siberian frost, "believed he could steal from me. He believed his bloodline would protect him. He was wrong on both counts. But you, Irene Ivankov, you are his redemption or his damnation. We shall see which." Irene's pride flared. "I'm not property." Sergei's laugh was a low rumble. "Your naivety is charming, but property is exactly what you are. The papers are already signed. Your brother lives because I allow it. Your father's firm survives because I will it. And you—" He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne mixed with gunpowder. "You will learn to kneel before you learn to stand." The Mogilevich stronghold was a fortress disguised as a palace. Every room held secrets, hidden doors, panic rooms, armories concealed behind Baroque mirrors. Irene was given a suite in the East Wing, luxurious but isolated, with guards posted at every exit. She wasn't a guest. She was an investment under surveillance. Sergei summoned her 3 days later to his private study. The room smelled of leather and old whiskey, walls lined with first editions in Russian, German, and English. He sat behind an enormous oak desk, reading a dossier that Irene recognized with horror. Her entire life, catalogued and analyzed. Her university transcripts, her design portfolio, even photographs of her morning coffee runs. "You studied architecture," Sergei said without looking up. "Top of the class, specialized in structural integrity and urban planning." He closed the folder, his gaze pinning her in place. "Good. You understand foundations, pressure points, how things collapse." He stood, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. "You will need that knowledge here. My empire is built on foundations of blood and bone, and now you are part of that structure." "I won't help you," Irene said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You misunderstand." Sergei's smile was wolfish. "I don't need your help. I need your obedience. But I am not a wasteful man. Your brother traded you for his worthless life, but I see potential in you. Intelligence, fire." He traced a finger along her jawline, and she flinched. "I could break that fire, make you a hollow, obedient thing, but where is the satisfaction in that?" He stepped back, hands clasped behind him like a general. "Instead, I will forge you, remake you into something worthy of the Mogilevich name, and when I'm finished, you will kneel, not because I force you, but because you choose to."
The wedding was a spectacle of power and intimidation. Sergei arranged it at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the most sacred Orthodox church in Moscow, bribing priests and officials alike to overlook the grotesque transaction at its heart. Irene stood before the altar in a dress of white silk and lace, a beautiful cage, while the pews filled with the most dangerous men in Eastern Europe. They came to witness Sergei claim his prize, to see if the young woman had the spine to stand beside a kingpin or if she would crumble. The priest's words washed over her in Church Slavonic, ancient and incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear when Sergei took her hand. His grip was iron, his voice a low command when he spoke his vows, not promises of love, but declarations of ownership. "You are mine now, in this life and whatever comes after." Irene's turn came, and she surprised them all. Instead of the meek, scripted response, she looked Sergei directly in the eyes and said in clear Russian, "I am no man's possession, but I will survive you, Sergei Mogilevich. Remember that." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Men reached for weapons instinctively, but Sergei, he smiled, a genuine, terrifying expression of delight. He leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "Good, you have teeth. I would be disappointed otherwise." When he kissed her to seal their vows, it was a claiming, brutal, possessive, a promise of things to come. And when they exited the cathedral into the bitter Moscow winter, Irene realized the guards weren't there to protect her. They were there to ensure no one else could take what Sergei now considered his most valuable asset. If you can't stand people who treat human beings as property, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that," because what happened next only got worse. Sergei denied her. That was the cruelest shock of all. Irene had braced herself for violation, for the inevitable consumption of her body by a man who'd bought her like livestock. But night after night, Sergei left her untouched. Instead, he did something far more insidious. He began to train her. At dawn, she was dragged from bed by Yuri, Sergei's head of security, for hand-to-hand combat training. "The boss says you need to survive if the wolves come," Yuri grunted, teaching her pressure points, how to disable a man twice her size, where to strike to kill. Her body became a map of bruises and aching muscles. Afternoons were spent in Sergei's office, where he forced her to sit beside him during meetings with lieutenants, drug distributors, politicians on his payroll. He explained every transaction in cold detail, how money was laundered through construction projects, how competitors were eliminated, how loyalty was purchased with blood and gold. "You need to understand the business of power," he told her, "because the moment I show weakness, they will come for you to hurt me, and I need you sharp enough to survive." Evenings, he summoned her to his private quarters, not for intimacy, but for chess. He taught her strategy, patience, how to think 3 moves ahead. "You play like you live," he observed after she lost her 7th game in a row. "Reactively, always defending, never attacking. That will get you killed here." Weeks turned into months. Irene's body hardened, her mind sharpened, but the most dangerous transformation was internal. She began to understand Sergei's world, the brutal logic of it, the chess game played with human lives. And against every instinct, she began to see him not as a monster, but as a man who'd survived by becoming more ruthless than everyone around him. Still, he never touched her, never took what he'd legally claimed. The denial was its own form of torture, a psychological game she didn't fully understand. Until one night, after she'd successfully negotiated the release of one of his men from a rival's custody using only her wits and nerve, Sergei looked at her across the candlelit dining table and said, "You're almost ready." "Ready for what?" Irene demanded. "To be my equal," he replied. "I didn't buy you for your body, Irene. Any fool with money can purchase flesh. I bought you because your brother's stupidity delivered me something rare, a woman with the intelligence and fire to stand beside me, not beneath me. But you had to be forged first. Softness gets you killed in this world." The Petrov Charity Gala was where Moscow's elite laundered their reputations, where oligarchs and crime lords mingled with politicians and socialites under crystal chandeliers. Sergei brought Irene as his official debut, her hand resting on his arm, a diamond choker around her throat that cost more than most people's homes. She wore crimson, his color, and every eye in the room tracked her entrance. Among the predators circling was Semyon Rossetti, a rival boss from St. Petersburg who'd been encroaching on Mogilevich territory for months. He was younger than Sergei, hungry, ambitious, and foolish enough to see Irene as a vulnerability. He approached with a shark smile, champagne in hand. "So, this is the famous Collateral. Tell me, my dear, does he keep you locked in a gilded cage, or do you actually have a voice?" Sergei's hand tightened imperceptibly on her waist, a warning. But Irene had spent months learning the language of power. She turned to Rossetti with a smile of her own, cold and sharp. "Cages are for birds and broken things, Mr. Rossetti. I am neither. But I'm curious. Do you always approach another man's wife with such desperation, or is it only when you're losing territories you can't afford to keep?" The nearby conversation stopped. Rossetti's smile froze. Sergei's low chuckle was the only sound. "My wife speaks truly," Sergei said, his voice carrying a lethal edge. "Your operations in Viborg are bleeding money. Your men are defecting. Perhaps you should focus on saving your own empire before you attempt to insult mine." Rossetti's face purpled with rage, but he knew better than to escalate publicly. He retreated with a muttered excuse, and Irene felt Sergei's hand slide possessively to the small of her back. For the rest of the evening, she was treated not as property, but as a queen, dangerous, intelligent, and wholly Mogilevich. That night, in the car ride home, Sergei finally looked at her with something other than calculation. "You humiliated Rossetti beautifully. He will come for us now, of course, but you made him look weak in front of the families. That was impressive." "I learned from a ruthless teacher," Irene replied. Sergei's eyes darkened with something that made her breath catch. "You have no idea how ruthless I can be, Irene, but you will. If you believe intelligence and courage are more valuable than brutality, hit that subscribe button. People like Rossetti won't, and you need to hear what she did about it." The library was Irene's sanctuary, the only room in the estate where she felt almost free. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of volumes in a dozen languages, and in the late hours when the rest of the house slept, she would lose herself in architecture texts and novels alike. She didn't hear Sergei enter, didn't notice him until she turned and found him watching her from the doorway, still in his shirt and slacks from dinner, tie loosened, looking almost human. "You read Dostoevsky in the original Russian," he observed, nodding at the book in her hands. "My grandmother taught me, before she died." Sergei moved into the room, pouring 2 glasses of cognac from the bar cart. He offered her one, and when their fingers brushed, she felt the same electric charge that had been building for months. "My mother read to me from that same edition," he said quietly, settling into the leather chair across from her. "Before the soldiers came, before I learned that literature doesn't stop bullets." It was the first personal thing he'd ever shared. Irene sat, cradling the cognac, watching this man who'd bought her slowly peel back a layer of armor. What happened to her? "She died protecting me, stood between me and men with guns, believing her body was shield enough." Her eyes met Irene's, and for the first time she saw the boy he'd been. She was wrong, but her sacrifice taught me an essential truth. Love is the most dangerous weakness a man can have. It makes you vulnerable, gets you killed. "Is that why you've kept your distance?" Irene asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Because you're afraid of being weak?" Sergei stood abruptly, crossing to her in 3 strides. He cupped her face with surprising gentleness, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "I keep my distance because the moment I touch you the way I want to, there will be no going back. You will be the weakness that destroys me, Irene Ivankov, and I have spent 30 years ensuring nothing could." "Maybe destruction isn't the worst thing," Irene whispered, her heart hammering. He kissed her then, not the brutal claiming of their wedding, but something deeper, more dangerous, a surrender disguised as conquest. When he pulled back, his breathing was ragged. "You have no idea what you're asking for." "Then show me," she challenged. That night, Sergei finally claimed what he'd paid for, but it wasn't the cold transaction Irene had feared. It was fire and fury, a collision of 2 people who'd been circling each other for months. And when dawn broke over Moscow, everything had changed. She was no longer just collateral. She was his obsession. The attack came 2 weeks later. Simeon Rossetti, humiliated and desperate, orchestrated it with military precision, luring Sergei away with false intelligence about a warehouse raid while sending his men to siege the estate. Irene was in the East Wing when the first explosion shattered the morning quiet, when bullets began punching through marble and glass. Yuri found her immediately, pressing a Glock into her hands. "The boss is 30 minutes out. We hold until then or we die." Around them, Sergei's men were already taking positions, but Irene could see the fear in their eyes. They were outnumbered. For a moment, terror threatened to swallow her. She was an architect, not a soldier. But then she remembered every brutal lesson Sergei had taught her, every midnight training session, every strategic principle he drilled into her head. She wasn't helpless. She was a Mogilevich now. "The East Wing is indefensible," she told Yuri, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Funnel them through the gallery. It's a kill box if we position right." She grabbed the security tablet, pulling up the camera feeds, and began directing the defense like the strategic game it was. Rossetti's men came in waves, expecting chaos and finding organized resistance instead. Irene moved through the battle with terrifying calm, directing fire, calling out positions, even putting down 2 attackers herself when they breached the gallery. Her white blouse was spattered with blood, some hers, most not, but she didn't stop until she heard the roar of engines and Sergei's voice over the comms, lethal and furious. When he stormed into the gallery 15 minutes later, flanked by 50 reinforcements, the siege was already breaking. His men were rallying around Irene's position, holding the line she'd drawn. And there she stood, gun in hand, surrounded by bodies, her eyes blazing with the same ruthless fire he'd spent months igniting. Sergei stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Then he did something that shocked every man present. He went to one knee before her, taking her bloodied hand in his. "Forgive me," he said, his voice raw. "I left you vulnerable. I will never make that mistake again."
In the aftermath of the siege, something fundamental shifted. Sergei, the man who'd commanded armies of killers, who'd never bowed to anyone, became utterly devoted to Irene. He executed Rossetti personally, sending the message that anyone who threatened his wife would face his wrath. But more than that, he began to dismantle the very walls he'd spent decades building. He taught her everything, every account, every alliance, every secret. "If something happens to me," he told her in the quiet hours, "you need to be able to survive, to rule if necessary." He introduced her to his network not as property, but as partner, and the underworld watched in fascination as the Siberian wolf became domesticated by the woman he'd bought. But the true transformation came the night Irene told him she was pregnant. Sergei, who'd faced down armies without flinching, turned pale. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with a reverence that would have been laughable months ago. And when he looked up at her, there were tears in his eyes. "I can't bring a child into this world, into this life of blood." "Then change it," Irene said simply. "You have the power." And he did. Over the next months, as Irene's pregnancy progressed, Sergei began the impossible, legitimizing the Mogilevich empire. He divested from drugs and weapons, shifted into real estate and technology, turned blood money into clean investments. His men thought he'd gone soft, but Irene knew the truth. He'd finally found something more valuable than power: a future. The bosses who challenged the transition were crushed with the same ruthless efficiency that built his empire. But now it was in service of creation rather than destruction. And through it all, Sergei treated Irene like the queen she'd become, consulting her on decisions, deferring to her judgment, even taking orders when her architectural expertise could solve problems his violence couldn't. The man who'd commanded her to kneel now knelt willingly. The Kingpin who'd bought her like property had become a slave to his love for her.
Their daughter was born on a winter morning, screaming her fury at the world just like her mother. Sergei held the tiny, perfect creature with hands that had killed countless men.
and Irene watched the last of the old Mogilevich die in that moment. He named her Anastasia, Resurrection, because that's what she represented. The penthouse that had once been Irene's prison was now filled with laughter and light. Sergei Industries became one of Russia's most successful legitimate corporations, building the skyline Irene designed, creating jobs instead of taking lives. The wolves of the underworld still remembered Sergei Mogilevich, but they saw him now as a cautionary tale, a king who'd given up his throne for love. But Irene knew better. He hadn't lost anything. He'd gained everything. On their daughter's first birthday, as Moscow glittered below them, and family, real family, not soldiers, gathered in celebration, Sergei pulled Irene close. "Do you remember what I told you that first night, that you would learn to crave the weight of your chains?" Irene smiled, placing his hand over her heart where their second child grew. "You were wrong. I broke my chains, and then I claimed a king." Sergei laughed, the sound rich and genuine, and kissed her with the devotion of a man who'd found his salvation in the woman he'd once tried to own. "You didn't claim a king, my love. You remade him, and I am yours, body, empire, and soul, until the day I die." The deadly boss had become a devoted husband, the collateral had become a queen, and the empire built on blood had been transformed into a legacy of love. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation isn't conquering your enemies, it's surrendering to the one person who sees past your armor to the human beneath. Sergei Mogilevich had been the most feared man in Moscow, but Irene Ivankov had done what no army could. She'd made him choose love over power, family over fear, and in doing so, she'd won a war he never saw coming.